Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 10. American Government. State and Local Government. Part 1. Federal and State Powers. This lesson explains some of the structures and functions of state and local government. It discusses how state governments and local governments are different from the federal government and how they are similar. The U.S. Constitution was written by the Founding Fathers at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. To this day, the Constitution is the law above all other laws in the United States. In other words, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The Constitution sets up the government, defines the government, and protects basic rights of Americans. More specifically, the Constitution sets up the federal system of government, which is the system governing the entire United States. The Constitution defines the federal government of the United States by listing the three branches of the government and their many parts, and explaining what they do. The U.S. federal system of government has a central government at the top and state and local governments below. State governments and local governments, like city councils, can make their own decisions and rules about some matters, but no government in the United States can legally make decisions that go against the federal government, or against the Constitution, which sets up the federal government. No state, territory, or local government can take away rights the Constitution says belong to all Americans. Because of this, the Constitution protects basic rights of Americans in every U.S. state and territory. Civics Test Question. What does the Constitution do? What does the Constitution do? Sets up the government. The Constitution sets up the government and defines the government. In putting limits on what the government can do and defining some of the freedoms of people in the United States, it also protects basic rights of Americans. Civics Test Question. What is the supreme law of the land? What is the supreme law of the land? The Constitution. No state or local government in the United States is allowed to make laws that go against the supreme law of the land, the Constitution. There are three levels of government in the United States: local, state, and federal. The federal government is the government over all of the United States. Members of all three branches of the federal government meet in Washington, D.C. to carry out their governmental duties, which makes Washington, D.C. the capital city of the entire country. People in federal government carry out many duties and responsibilities that affect all 50 states and every territory of the United States. Each part of federal government has different jobs to do. Some federal government officials deal with foreign governments and international policy. Some tackle law enforcement issues that impact multiple states or territories. Some create laws that apply to the whole country. Some interpret and explain laws of national relevance. Below the federal government are 50 state governments. State governments have many of the same powers and responsibilities as the federal government, but on a smaller scale, because each state government's power is limited to their state alone. For example, when the Connecticut legislature passes a new bill about how the school system works, and the Connecticut governor signs it into law, the new law only affects Connecticut schools. It doesn't have any impact on how the school system works in Florida or in Maryland. At the local level, there are thousands upon thousands of governments that deal with issues that impact even smaller groups of people. Although local governments are not as big and powerful as state governments or the federal government, they are still important to keeping things running smoothly and safely in cities and towns throughout the nation. Local governments can't make decisions that go against the government of the state that they are in, or against the federal government, but they can make some rules and regulations that differ from those of other local governments. Some rules that apply to people living in Hartford, Connecticut, for example, are different from rules that apply to residents of New Britain or of Meriden, even though these cities are all in the same state. The public programs and services managed by one local government can look a bit different from those managed by other local governments, too, even in towns that are only a few miles apart from each other. In the United States, the federal government and state governments have some separate powers, but they also have some shared powers. For example, both federal and state governments collect taxes and establish courts, so these are shared powers. Other shared powers of the federal government and state governments are the power to make and enforce laws and the power to build roads. The only difference is that the federal government does these things at the national level, while state governments do them at the state level. The federal government provides partial funding for interstate highways to be built and repaired, for instance, while state governments are usually responsible on their own for building and maintaining roads that run only within the borders of their respective states. Some powers, however, are not shared. These powers belong to either the state governments or to the federal government, but not to both. Under the U.S. Constitution, some powers granted to the federal government alone are the power to print money, the power to create an army, the power to declare war, and the power to make treaties. State governments are not allowed to do any of these things. There's no such thing, for example, as Connecticut dollars. U.S. dollars must be printed by the federal treasury to be legal tender. Civics test question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government? Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government? To print money. Some powers that belong to the federal government are the powers to print money, to declare war, to create an army, and to make treaties. However, the Constitution also establishes that state governments have the power to make many decisions and laws within their own borders, as long as these laws do not go against the Constitution or against other federal laws. Part of the Constitution that mentions the power of state governments to make their own laws is found in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is what we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. These 10 additions to the Constitution were made early on in U.S. history because some founding fathers were worried that the federal government might use its many powers to take away individual and state rights. Even staunch advocates for a strong central government, like James Madison, agreed that protecting state and individual rights against abuse from the federal government was an issue the Constitution needed to address. Madison was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. Alongside Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, Madison had written these essays to argue that the United States needed a strong central government to survive as a country. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay had supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution by writing the Federalist Papers, promoting giving the federal government many important powers separate from state governments. After Madison helped write the Federalist Papers, however, he also helped write the Bill of Rights. which protects the basic rights or freedoms of Americans, even against lawmakers and other officials in federal government. The final article of the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, states that any powers the Constitution does not expressly give to the federal government belong to the states or to the people. This was an important addition to the Constitution because it clarifies that while some powers belong to the federal government alone, state governments also have the power to make many important decisions for themselves. Civics test question. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Name one of the writers. Madison. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers was James Madison. The other two authors of the Federalist Papers were Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. Madison, Hamilton, and Jay also all used the pen name Publius. Civics test question. What is an amendment? What is an amendment? A change. An amendment is a change to the Constitution, or an addition to the Constitution. Civics test question. What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? The Bill of Rights. We call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution the Bill of Rights. While the federal government oversees many kinds of nationwide operations in the United States, state governments are responsible for making sure things run smoothly in other areas. Some powers that belong to state governments are the powers to provide schooling and education, to provide protection through police departments, to provide safety through fire departments, and to give a driver's license. State governments are also the ones to approve zoning and land use in most cases. Zoning determines how plots of land can be used, the types of buildings that can be built in a designated area, and so on. Since state governments are the authorities with the power to give people driver's licenses, driving test rules and the appearance of driver's licenses differ from state to state. If you have a driver's license or learner's permit, you'll see the name of the state that gave you the license printed somewhere prominently on the card. Connecticut driver's licenses feature the outline of the state border and carry the signature of the Connecticut DMV commissioner. The commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Motor Vehicles works for the state government and is appointed by the state governor. Connecticut driver's licenses and learner's permits also depict symbols important to Connecticut's history. On a Connecticut license, you might notice, for example, a picture of a sperm whale, which reminds us of how many Connecticut residents of the 1800s were whalers. You might also see a picture of a type of fighter plane used in World War II and in the Korean War, which reminds us of how Connecticut was a large manufacturer of U.S. military aircraft in the 1900s. If you have a Connecticut driver's license and move to another state in the United States, you'll need to get a new license from the state to which you've moved. This is because it is state governments, not the federal government, that give a driver's license. Another power of state governments is to provide safety by overseeing fire departments. Managing fire departments is a power the state government shares with local governments. Individual towns and cities, like West Hartford or New London in Connecticut, each have their own fire departments managed by their respective local governments. Just as the federal government and state governments have some shared powers, state and local governments have some shared powers. In Connecticut, one of the powers shared by localities and the state is the power to provide and regulate fire protection services. Civics test question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power of the states? To give a driver's license. Some powers that belong to the states are the powers to give a driver's license, to provide safety, to provide schooling and education, to provide protection, and to approve zoning and land use.